So this is a walkthrough of the article, Drone Strikes Save Lives, American and Other. In the left-hand column will be the article, just broken out by paragraph. This first slide here will just have the first part of the article, the next slide will have the next part of the article, and so on. In the middle column are my initial thoughts. Now, when I say initial thoughts, I don't mean the thoughts I have reading the article for the first time. You should read all the way through the article before you start writing down anything. So these are, I've read through the article once, now I'm going back through again, so I already have a sense of where it's going, what it's saying, and now I'm going to take notes. And my first note is that it's not clear to me why the author is saying this is a tough call, or why the author is saying drone warfare has done a lot of good for the US and could cause a lot of harm. It seems like, having done the one read through, the conclusion of the article is broadly in the pro-drone neighborhood, like drone strikes are a good idea. And the claim that this is a tough call would not help you conclude that that drone strikes are a good idea. The claim that drone warfare has done a lot of good would, but the claim that it could cause a lot of harm wouldn't drive towards the conclusion that drone strikes are, broadly speaking, good. Now, the next claim, having read through it once, coming back through again, seems to me to be the thesis, the central claim, the final conclusion that the author's drawing. One way to think about it is, if the author could only say one sentence, what's your claim? What claim are you making? What sentence would they say? That's the conclusion. So here the author's conclusion looks kind of complex, but a conclusion can be complex. So the conclusion is that from the US perspective, drone strikes have done more good than harm and should be continued, provided that the Obama administration can offer more clarity on what's being done and can provide a sound legal justification for doing it. So something like this is the final conclusion. Now, as I go through more, I'll modify it a little bit, but that's in the neighborhood of the final conclusion. Next, we get a little argument. So one point in favor of drone strikes is that they're weakening Al-Qaeda, the Taliban-affiliated groups, and hence protecting lives, American and other. Anytime you see a word like hence or therefore or so or consequently, you know that there's an argument, a conclusion being drawn. So how do we represent this argument? Well, there's a single premise that drone strikes are weakening Al-Qaeda and similar groups. And then you get the conclusion that they're protecting lives. So you can say drone strikes are protecting Al-Qaeda and these other groups. If so, then they're protecting American lives. Therefore, they're protecting American lives. Now, it's crucial that you add in the if-then premise, and we talked about why in class. One reason why is because sometimes that suppressed premise, sometimes the one that's not explicitly stated over here, will be especially implausible. So it's important to make the author explicitly assert it. In this case, the premise is not especially implausible. So it's not like you're detecting any trickery when you assert it, but it's still important to assert it to make sure the argument comes out valid. Next, there doesn't seem to be a better means of doing so. This looks like a premise that there's no better way than drone strikes to protect American lives. So now let's continue on with the article. So the next part of the article asserts that points against drone strikes are this, that, and the other. Well, remember, the article is broadly speaking in favor of drone strikes, so the odds are that any claim about drone strikes being bad is not going to be part of the argument. So I'll leave that out. Next, these are all valid points and reasonable people can disagree. Well, again, the fact that these are valid points and that reasonable people can disagree does not drive towards the central thesis that drone strikes should be continued provided that certain conditions can be met. So that's probably not going to be part of the argument. So let's continue on. The author says, my own reasoning turns on 4 arguments. This is now indicating that arguments are coming, but that sentence itself is not going to be part of the argument, right? So first, states have a primary responsibility for the protection of their own citizens. That looks like a premise. Next, if drone strikes are the best way to remove an ultra-real threat to American lives, that's an especially weighted consideration. That looks like a premise, and it looks like logically it's connected to the previous one. Why? Well, here's a plausible claim. If states have a primary responsibility to protect their citizens, if that's right, then if drone strikes remove a threat to US citizens, then that's really important. So it looks like there's a logical relationship between these two statements, a rational relationship, and we're trying to capture that here. Next, I doubt that ending drone strikes would reduce anti-American sentiment in the Islamic world. Oh, sorry, I left out. Here's a conclusion that we draw from these things because we have the premise here. So we say if states have a primary responsibility for the protection of their own citizens, then if drone strikes are the best way to remove this threat, they should continue. So now, since we have that states have a primary responsibility, we can get rid of this first part and just conclude the second part. If drones are the best way to remove this threat, that's a weighty consideration. So now coming down here, I doubt that ending drone strikes would substantially reduce anti-American sentiment. Well, that looks like a premise. You can get rid of the I doubt and just say ending drone strikes wouldn't do it. Okay? So continuing on with the article, third, the U.S. can do a lot to moderate some of the harms. This looks like a premise. Some of what's bad about drone strikes can be eliminated by being clearer about what's going on with them. And then finally, there's evidence that drone strikes are less harmful to civilians. Well, that looks like a premise. Drone strikes are less harmful to civilians than other relevant means. And the author then says, and that's what's required legally and ethically. So this looks like a premise. If drone strikes are less harmful to civilians, if since that's what's required, then drone strikes satisfy the ethical requirement of minimizing civilian casualties. And this really, I should have really written the legal requirement here too, so I'm just going to change that. The ethical and legal requirement of minimizing civilian casualties. I added the legal here because the author says that's what's required legally and ethically. Okay? And again, you'll notice that the author didn't state the rational relationship between these two claims, but clearly there is one, and the author does have, as part of this, finally this fourth point, the second sentence down here. So think about it. It says, if drone strikes are less harmful to civilians than other means, then they satisfy legal and ethical requirements for minimizing casualties, and that seems right. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go back through again a second time. And this time I have my notes in front of me, and I'm going to look at my notes, and I can refer back to the original text, but I'm primarily looking at my notes to try and see, having gone through and started to set out the argument, what do I really think about these points? And I decide that these things here, they just aren't relevant. I can ignore these sentences. They're just not doing any work. I also decide that this thing here really is the thesis. So I might need to modify it a little bit, but this more or less is what the author is arguing for at the end of the day. So this should be the conclusion. So everything that I'm going to include in the argument should be trying to get me here. Now I come down here and I remember this little argument and I decide this argument really does seem to be part of the key reason the author thinks the conclusion is true. So this little argument concludes that drone strikes are protecting American lives, and when the author concludes that drone strikes have done more good than harm, the fact that drone strikes are protecting American lives seems like it will be a premise that figures into that conclusion. So I'm going to identify it as an important premise. There doesn't seem to be a better means of protecting those lives. For similar reasons, that seems like it's a central premise. Now let's go on to the next page. We had these 2 points I wasn't sure about, and I decide, look, they're not really advancing the central thesis, so I'm just going to leave them out. So I'm never going to refer back to these again. How about this here? Well, this one here, that states have a primary responsibility for protecting their own citizens, that seems to be central, because remember, we want to conclude that drone strikes should continue provided that these two conditions are satisfied. The Obama administration can offer more clarity about what's going on, and they can, there's a good legal justification. So provided that those conditions are satisfied, drone strikes should continue. That's the final conclusion. We saw in the last slide that drone strikes are protecting American lives, and now we see that states have a primary responsibility to do just that, which gives you reason to think drone strikes should continue, provided that the other conditions can be satisfied. What about this next one? Well, this seems like an important argument too. It concludes that, it basically says that it's an important fact in deciding whether drone strikes are good or bad, that they're the best way to remove a threat. And that seems like it can help us get to the conclusion that drone strikes should continue, given certain provisos. So correspondingly, that seems to be central. What about this one down here? Ending drone strikes wouldn't reduce anti-Americanism. Well, that seems to be relevant too. The idea would be that even if drone strikes are protecting American lives, if they're doing more harm to American lives than they are getting protection, maybe they should stop. And this is trying to counter that concern and say they're not doing more harm. Let's continue along. Some of what's bad about drones can be eliminated. Well, that seems to be important. It's not clear to me exactly how, but it seems to be important. What about this? Drone strikes are less harmful than other means. Well, that seems to be important. And then we get, if they're less harmful, then that can help us, show that we've satisfied the legal requirements for a strike during wartime. That seems really important. It's because remember the final conclusion talked about showing that drone strikes are illegal. So that seems like it's going to be important. So now I take all those claims that I identified as important and I start to organize them into an argument. So first up, I'm going to look at the conclusion and see, do I need to clarify the conclusion at all? And I'll start by looking, well, from the US perspective, drone strikes have done more good than harm and should be continued, provided that the Obama administration can offer more clarity on what's being done and provide a sound legal justification. Well, there's a couple of things to note here. One is drone strikes should be continued if the Obama administration can satisfy these conditions. Why? Because provided that and if mean the same thing. And the other is that if you look back to the last slide, it looks like the author is offering reason to think that drone strikes do satisfy legal requirements, right? We have that drone strikes are legally good, so I forgot to add that back here. The ethical and legal requirements of minimizing civilian casualties are satisfied. So we might say that really the conclusion here should get rid of the concern about legal justification because we're going to have that. So rather than having this as the conclusion, I'm going to keep them both just so you can compare them, but I'll bold this one so you know it's the one I'm going to work with. Drone strikes should be continued if the Obama administration can offer more clarity on what's being done, because it looks like we're going to get an argument that we do have a sound legal justification. So something like that will be the conclusion. And let's continue on. Here's various claims that we pulled out, and I'm going to try and sort of start working them towards looking like an argument. So we have this little argument that was here, and I'm just going to make it clearer. So drone strikes are weakening Al-Qaeda. If that's right, they're protecting American lives, so they're protecting American lives. And I'm going to give this one a number. There's no better way of protecting American lives. States have a primary responsibility to protect their own citizens. If states have a primary responsibility to protect their own citizens, then if drone strikes are protecting American lives and there's no better way of doing that, then they should continue. So that's now capturing something like what's over here. Then we can say if drone strikes are protecting American lives and there's no better way of doing that, then drone strikes should continue. And that's a conclusion from 6 and 5. And then we get drone strikes should continue. How do we decide that? Well, we've earlier said 3 and 4 are true. And here we say if 3 and 4 are true, then drone strikes should continue. So we decide drone strikes should continue. Now notice that this conclusion is stronger than what we identified as the conclusion, because what we identified as the conclusion is this. Drone strikes should continue if the Obama administration can offer more clarity on what's being done. So something isn't quite right. We're going to either want to change what we think the final conclusion is or adjust this argument so that it doesn't come out with this conclusion, which is a little bit too robust compared to what we thought the conclusion was. Now I'm going to continue along here with the things that I've pulled out. Well, it looks like that one's a premise, so I'm going to give it a number. Ending drone strikes would not reduce anti-Americanism. This one here, it wasn't clear to me exactly how to think about it, so I decided to just leave it out and maybe look back at it if I feel like there's a need, if something's missing, but otherwise leave it out. Next, this one does look like a premise. Drone strikes are less harmful to civilians than other means of achieving the same goals. And then this looks like a premise too. If drone strikes are less harmful to civilians than other means of achieving the same goals, and there is good reason to be in an armed conflict in those areas, then drone strikes are ethical. And really here it looks like we should have and legal, because the author says, remember we changed this to and legal requirements. Okay. So now we have our conclusion. Drone strikes should be continued if the Obama administration can offer more clarity about what's being done. And remember, we decided to get rid of the legal qualification because the author seems to think that's satisfied. That is, it's true that there's a good legal justification. So I'm now just going to pull out those numbered claims that I established. And remember, so I pull out those numbered claims that I established, and I'm just going to look at them for a minute and start to think, how do these fit together? What can I do with them? Is there a way to make them into a single, clear, cogent argument? So So I'll stop this video here and continue going through this, working this into a clear argument on the next video.